like to begin, if I may, by adding from Britain my own expression of sympathy and solidarity with our Norwegian hosts, together with an expression of admiration and gratitude for the way in which you have, out of the horrific experience of last month, created hope for the future for all of us. Thank you. As you know, I'm going to be speaking about the ethics of war and peace. I won't spell out the connections with last month's events, but I hope that they will be apparent. Questions about the morality of war are difficult because they reflect a deep conflict between two different kinds of moral values. Both of them values which I think all humanists would endorse. On the one hand, there's what we can refer to as the unique and irreplaceable value of individual human lives. This is what religious people often refer to as the idea of the sanctity of life, the idea that life is sacred. Indeed, we might use that language ourselves. But what has value is not just life in the abstract, but individual human lives. We need to think about just what this means. That each human life is a unique world, a unique consciousness, a unique sequence of experiences, which brings with it a unique sequence of hopes and plans and achievements, of joys and sorrows. And when that life ends, when that unique consciousness comes to an end, it can never be recreated or repeated. And that's what underpins, I think, the idea that killing another human being is a terrible wrong. And of course, war is by its very nature killing on a mass scale. And that's why the case for pacifism is obviously strong. The idea that since one should never take any human life, participation in war can never be justified at all. But that's though it's an appealing position, it's also a difficult one to take because of the second kind of moral value that I want to refer to. And that's the recognition that we cannot escape a responsibility for the consequences of our actions or the consequences of our failure to act. The harsh fact in a harsh world is that sometimes doing something terrible may be the only way of preventing even more terrible consequences. And that's why we can't rule out the possibility that war may sometimes be necessary. The theme throughout this Congress, of course, is the obvious desirability of peace over war, the desirability of dialogue over violence. But the fact remains that the question of war may nevertheless present us with terrible dilemmas. Now, the so-called just war tradition is an attempt to grapple with this dilemma. It's a way of thinking which grows out of the Christian tradition. The early Christians refused to serve in war. But when Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, that simple position no longer was sufficient. And that's not simply for cynical reasons to do with the accommodation of Christianity with power, but also because in the real world of politics, decisions about peace and war can't just be decisions about the purity of the individual conscience. And so, over centuries, Christian thinkers such as Augustine and Aquinas attempted to develop a more complex way of thinking about the morality of war. And over time, that tradition of thought, the just war tradition, has become wider than just the Christian tradition. It's become a part of secular moral thinking, and it's been enormously influential. I think it's fair to say that the just war tradition has become the dominant way of thinking about the ethics of war and peace, certainly for much of the world, and especially for the Western world. It's reflected in international law, and reflected in the United Nations Charter, and that's why we need to look at it seriously and assess it seriously. Now, the preliminary point to make is that we shouldn't be misled by that phrase, just war. People sometimes bandy it about as though it were just a sort of contradiction in terms. The just war theory is not the view that war is always just, or even the view that war is even typically just. It's not a position that glorifies war at all. It starts from the recognition that war is very difficult to justify morally, and what it attempts to do is to identify strict conditions that have to be met in order for any war to count as just. Just war theory has standardly been divided into two parts, which have been standardly referred to by the two Latin phrases, jus ad bellum, which addresses the question of when it's right to go to war in the first place, and jus in bello, the question of what it is right to do in war, in the fighting of war. These are the conditions that standardly, as the just war tradition has developed, have emerged as the conditions that have to be met for the requirement of jus ad bellum. First, that the war must be fought for a just cause. That sounds obvious, but there's a lot more to be said there, and I'll come back to that shortly. Then the requirement of what's standardly referred to as proportionality, that the good to achieved or the evil to be averted by war must be proportional, it must be sufficiently great to outweigh the enormous costs of war. Then that there must be a reasonable hope of success. There's no moral case for going to war, even if the cause is just. There's no moral case for going to war if there's little hope of achieving the good or preventing the evil that is aimed at. And the war must be a last resort. It's acceptable to go to war only if there's no other way of achieving the good or preventing the evil at a less terrible cost, for example, through diplomacy or negotiations. And then the last two, that war should be waged only by a legitimate authority, only by a legitimate government, and that there must be a formal declaration of war. You can see immediately, I think, that that's rather a mixed bag, rather a mixed set of conditions. The first, as I've said, is fundamental, the requirement of just cause. That addresses the fundamental question of how war, as the killing of human beings, can ever be justified at all, and that's why it needs special consideration, and why I'll come back to it in a moment. The next three, I think, proportionality, reasonable hope of success, and the requirement that war should be a last resort, all reflect a recognition of the importance of consequences that I started by referring to. They all recognize that even if there is a just cause, that doesn't settle the question, that the consequences must be sufficiently great to outweigh the costs of war. And then the last two, I think, are pretty clearly less important, and I think it's fair to see those as simply the conventions of international relations, conventions that govern the relations between states. So then the second part of just war theory is the so-called theory of jus in bello, the discussion of what it is right to do in war, which addresses the question of how wars are fought. And the division into those two parts, as I say, reflects the fact that the theory recognizes that it's not enough that there should be a good reason to go to war in the first place. The war must also be fought in ways that are morally acceptable. And even if there is a just cause, even if the requirement of jus ad bellum is met, a war may still be unjust if it's fought in unjust ways, if it fails to meet the requirements of jus in bello. And the two main requirements of jus in bello are these two, proportionality again. But you can see how the notion of proportionality is being applied differently here. It's applied to the way in which the war is fought, and it's the requirement that the war should not be fought in ways which are so destructive that they outweigh the good to be achieved by war. And then secondly, the so-called principle of non-combatant immunity, the principle that in any war, innocent civilians must not be attacked or killed. We can illustrate these two principles, I think, by the example of nuclear war. The recognition that a war fought with nuclear weapons could not possibly meet those conditions. It couldn't meet the requirement of proportionality because the massive destructiveness of any nuclear war would inevitably destroy, wipe out all those features of civilized social life which any war must surely want to protect and preserve. And a war fought with nuclear weapons would fail to meet the requirement of non-combatant immunity. It would be indiscriminate. It would kill vast numbers of members of the civilian population. Military theorists in the 1950s, I think, tried, when talking about nuclear strategy to distinguish between counter-force strategies and counter-city strategies. But the distinction makes no sense when you're talking about nuclear weapons. They're so destructive. You can't decide whether to target a military installation or a populated area. They are the same thing when it comes to nuclear weapons because the destructiveness is so widespread. And so nuclear weapons then would fail to meet, I think it's generally agreed, they would fail to meet the requirement of proportionality, and they would fail to meet the requirement of non-combatant immunity. And I use that as an illustration to bring out what those requirements amount to. Now, as I said, the most fundamental of the conditions of jus ad bellum is that war must be fought for a just cause. And that's fundamental, and I want to come back to that now. And it may look vacuous. It may look as though all it's saying is, well, a just war has to be a just war. But there's more that's being said there. For a start, it rules out wars which are fought simply to promote national interests, however important those national interests might appear to be. It rules out a war fought to acquire an empire. It rules out wars fought to gain control of resources. It rules out wars fought even for loftier goals, for more humanitarian goals, if the attempt is simply to justify them in consequentialist terms. What the just cause requirement says is that any war must, to be morally acceptable, must be a response to a previous injustice, and it must be fought to put right that prior injustice. Now that's still pretty vague. What sort of prior injustice is going to count as a just cause? Initially, early Christian thinkers like Augustine tended to see just war as analogous to punishment and a way of responding to the injustices perpetrated by princes. But in the modern world, just war theory has increasingly been interpreted to say that the only injustice which can morally justify war is an act of aggression. In a world of nation-states, the modern world in which states are defined by territorial borders, it's argued that states characteristically act unjustly when they invade another nation's territory, when they commit